Okay, perfect. We're here. You're probably thinking to yourself, wow, Erica, it is 5:29. You are skinning the cat right there. And I'm like, yeah, I know. I had a lot of things to do. Let's just make sure this mic is somewhere where you can hear me. Put down here. Woo. Awesome. Where is it? There it is. I don't know if you can tell. I have this mountain I'm creating on my face. I'm growing it just for you. Eventually, I'm going to have a nice little giveaway where one lucky person can scale this mountain because it's going to be scalable really soon here. I don't know what happened. Just I don't usually get a zit there. That's what it is. I didn't say it. I didn't say it. You said it. I didn't say it. But that's where it is, and it's pretty scary. But it's okay. I'm no stranger to adult acne. I was also no stranger to teenage acne, but that's neither here nor there. So it is going to be a relatively short intro today because there was a million things going on. So now that we're here and we are at 5:30, let's get started. You probably remember from last time that we met Cy, actually met the person who is going to be doing the autopsy for Patty. And we are now going into that scene. So we're starting chapter 12. An icy blast hit me as I pushed through the faded plastic strips hanging just inside the door. I breathed into my hands and rubbed them together as I surveyed the room. 4 drawers were grouped into rows of 2, with one stacked on top of the other. They lined both walls on the left and the right. They were suspiciously shoulder width. It only took a heartbeat for me to put it together, and I didn't like the fact that I could be in here with more than one dead person. Thankfully, Sven was close, so I felt a little more grounded. Gemma was hunched over a metal table at the end of the room. A crisp sheet was folded over the body's visible parts, and just like that, I had a much better opinion of Gemma. I started towards her. My gut churned, and heartbeats passed by, one after the other, like an out-of-control carousel. I switched tactics and walked to Sven instead. Baby steps. His stance was laid back, and he gave me a warm smile as I walked up. That same calm, peaceful feeling surrounded me when I reached him. It was a bit of a mystery how much his mere presence made me feel so relaxed, but I wasn't fighting it. He wrapped an arm around my shoulders. The knot in my stomach eased a bit more. I linked my hands around his waist. He dropped a kiss onto my head that sent tingles to my toes. Yeah, I could get used to this. Have you taken a look? I inclined my head toward the body. His eyes shifted back to Gemma, who was still hard at work. I so didn't want her job. Not yet, he said. I've seen enough death to last me a few lifetimes, so I'm in no hurry. Weariness weighted his voice when he said it. Enough death to last lifetimes. That made me realize how much I didn't know about him. I didn't like that. There was no telling what sort of things he had been through, what sort of things he had done. Hell, logically, he could be responsible for any number of horrendous acts. I wanted that thought to scare me, but for some reason it didn't. It was actually comforting to know I wasn't the only one with secrets. We'd have to swap stories over coffee sometime. They probably weren't going to be pretty stories, but there was nothing better than coffee and mayhem, right? I must have had a strange expression on my face because Sven's forehead crinkled in sympathy, and he pulled me in for a hug. I sighed, and my breath molded his shirt to his chest. It just felt so right being in his arms. As much as I loved being with him, though, it wasn't getting us any closer to leaving. I tried to psych myself up as I pulled him out of his arms. Might as well do this. I finished the world's shortest walk to the gurney. A pungent smell hit me right before I reached the body. There was no doubt it was rank. But it wasn't until the touch of sickeningly sweet rot hit me and crawled around my stomach that I gagged. Oh, good, you're here, Gemma said by way of greeting. Look at this. She thrust me a pair of gloves. I prayed that didn't mean she expected me to touch anything. I went off that assumption and stretched the plastic over my hands as I wondered how many people had puked on a body, or if I was about to be the first. The corpse was lying face down. Thousands of tiny scratches covered its dirt-smeared back. That wasn't what held Gemma's attention, though. No, her attention was on the 2 severed bones jutting out of the shoulder blades. Her tiny latex gloved hands flitted over them. Revulsion rose inside me, and I had to choke it back. The report had said the wings had been removed, but nothing could prepare me for the violence of the act. Around the bones, skin looked like it had been ripped clear off, and dark muscle peeked through the jagged gap. I must have made a sound because it animated Gemma. I know, right? How is it even possible? Nobody's bones coming out of their back like this. At least I wouldn't have said they did right before now. It's crazy. It's the ultimate, like a dream come true. Her voice gushed with barely contained excitement. I'd have called it more of a nightmare. She turned to the briefcase propped open at her side and removed a gleaming scalpel. When she had her weapon of choice, she turned back to the body and placed her thumb and forefinger on either side of the bone. After 2 quick incisions in the shape of a cross, she laid it back down. Without pausing, she brought her fingers back up and inserted them into the new opening. My stomach heaved violently as her fingers flexed and moved underneath the corpse skin. Her fingers made a sucking sound as she pulled them out. I breathed in and out in shallow breaths, trying to contain my lunch. Gemma bounced up and down on the balls of her feet with excitement, oblivious to my torment. That's what I thought. Look at this. These bones are actually part of her bone structure. She gestured with long, sweeping motions at the bones. They're actually made to come out of the back like this, almost like wings, I suppose. Really? That's crazy. I tried to feign amazement despite my rioting insides. It probably wasn't a good act, but she was so excited I don't think she noticed. Yeah, give me your hands and I'll show you. The latex of her glove hit my wrist and I almost flew to the roof. I twisted my wrist and yanked it away. No, she laughed. Don't tell me you're afraid. I pulled myself to my full 5'5". It felt good to tower over someone for a change. I most certainly am not, but that doesn't mean it's not disgusting. Well, then you're crazy. How can you not be fascinated by a real wing-bearing human? She looked at me with a speculative gleam in her eyes. You knew about this, didn't you? I did get a detailed report, I admitted. Her tongue clicked in her mouth. How did you get this type of case anyway? You're a bounty hunter. I wanted to smack my forehead against the wall. Why were we having this discussion over a dead body? Call it a favor. Can we get on with this already? She turned back to the body with a smug smile. Well, if you get called on any more favors, let me know. The body didn't appear to be too concerned with our exchange and was in the same spot we left it in. Not that I would have minded if it had decided to leave. As a bonus, I was grateful to still feel the comfort of Sven's presence at my back. He seemed to be taking it all in stride. I was really starting to appreciate that about him. Gemma's hands skimmed and probed the body. She stopped every once in a while to scribble on a piece of paper lying next to her. Trying to focus on the task at hand rather than my almost overwhelming need to go into the next room, I gestured to the scratches decorating her back. What are these scratches? Was she tortured? No, they're too shallow. Gemma never stopped her examination as she answered. Whips would leave deeper gouges and paper cuts would be thinner and shallower. These don't have any rhyme or reason to them. I would wager from the dirt on her back, someone was dragging her. She fingered one of the cuts. Something stuck to her glove as she pulled away. Brushing dried blood off of it, she brought it closer to her face. Sure enough, a twig. They were probably dragging her through a forest. She dropped the twig onto the metal table with a ting and continued on. Maybe it was the nervous energy, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. Why do you think someone would have removed the wings? Hard to say, really. I wouldn't say a fight because the bones aren't splintered. They're cut at an angle. Deliberate. I'm not sure why they would have cut them off, though. To sell, maybe? I'm sure someone would pay a lot for human-sized bona fide wings, though I'm not sure if most people would have believed they were real. The latex of her gloves swished as she tried to snap her fingers as she came to a realization. I don't think she remembered she was wearing the gloves. Unless they were being used for some sort of spell, like witchcraft. She had a point. There were some Black Coven witches in New York City. I mentally added them to the list of things to check out. I gestured at the body, careful to keep my hands at a safe distance. So how did she die? She made a disgusted sound in her throat. What, you think this happens right away? Like I just come in here, wave my hands over the body, and presto! She threw her hands into the air and wiggled her fingers. This is a science, not magic. I tried not to be too embarrassed as she moved to the bottom of the table. Now help me turn over the body, she said, grabbing the corpse's feet. I backed up so fast I bumped into Sven. I didn't bother apologizing. I held up my hands and waved them like the act alone would make the idea go away. Hey, no way, Buttercup. I am not touching that thing. I'll do it, Sven said. I was going to thank him for offering to help, but he pinched my butt as he pushed his way in front of it. I stuck my tongue at him instead. Without ceremony, he grabbed the corpse's upper body. Gemma followed his lead and moved higher to grab the lower half. The body moved stiff and rubbery as they wrestled with it. It was like something out of a horror movie. In the process of flipping the body, masses of brown hair, not mine, obscured my vision. I gagged and unceremoniously threw up in my mouth. It burnt as I swallowed it back down. Tears leaked out of the corner of my eyes. I wiped them away as a shiver I couldn't quite suppress ran through me. Thankful it didn't begin to describe how I felt when I realized no one had seen my embarrassing display. They'd had problems of their own and had just finished wrestling the body onto its back. My thanks were short-lived, though. That hadn't been the worst of it. Chapter 13. Blue lips gaped open, frozen in a perfect O of agony. Straight teeth could be seen just inside the lips. I praised the gods her eyelids were closed to block off the brown eyes I had seen in the pictures. There was something personal about seeing someone's eyes, and I didn't want to see blank brown globes where the light of her soul should have been. Interesting. Gemma took the wrist of the corpse in her gloved hands and turned it over. With an effort, I tore my gaze away from the corpse's face. Now that I saw Patty in the flesh, so to speak, it was so much harder to keep this clinical. I wanted to find the person who caused this sweet girl so much pain and pump them with enough lightning to power Manhattan. What is it? I asked, the sudden lump in my throat making it difficult to speak. She ran a slender index finger over a group of red dots that ran in a diamond pattern with one over the middle. Puncture marks. Sven and I leaned over the wrist for a closer look. Sure enough, there were pin-sized holes in the bluish skin. What would have caused something like that? I asked. I had never seen anything like it. She took her thumbs and stretched a couple of the little holes. Well, they're definitely man-made. Are you talking about made from something a man made or teeth marks or something? I asked. I nodded. I needed to be clear on that. This was going to spell all sorts of problems if vampires were involved. They're not teeth, Sven said from behind me. I slanted him a look. How do you know? With that, he laughed. A lot. I was taking points away for that. Teeth marks from what? A baby, he said between chuckles. I shot a look at him that said he better stop before I sunk my teeth into him. He winked at me. My eyes narrowed in a glare that said, keep it up, but a smile tugged at the corners of my mouth as I turned back to the body. Gemma hit me with her elbow. Yes, by a man-made instrument. Okay, so what could have made these kind of marks? I asked. She chewed on her bottom lip for a contemplative second and then said, well, I haven't seen these exact markings before, but the closest thing I've seen is from medical equipment. Medical equipment? That I had not expected. Medical equipment? You don't know what it's used for, do you? You don't know what it was used for, do you? It was a long shot, but I had to ask. Gemma tapped her finger against her thin lower lip and looked over the body in contemplation. With the location, it isn't conclusive. Your best bet is to go to the medical supply dealer and see if they can identify what the instrument was used. That will tell you what it was used for. Gemma straightened. Let's proceed with the internal examination. She turned and picked up the scalpel from where she had laid it on the metal gurney. She cradled it in her hands and blew on it. And just like that, I was freezing again. My teeth started to chatter. Damn it. There was no way I could stand here and watch her cut Patty open. Desperation overtook me as I thought of any excuse I could make. I had rifled through a dozen when she stopped blowing on it and moved to the corpse's shoulder. Out of time, I threw out the first excuse I could think of. Gemma, I really have to take my dog to the... She knew I didn't have a dog, but she didn't bat an eye as the scalpel sliced into the flesh. I staggered back and held my breath to keep the contents of my stomach at bay. I couldn't look away as the knife continued its sawing. My back twitched as the knife skirted the breast and ended the journey at the bottom of the breastbone. Then the smooth edge of the blade came out of the blue-tinted flesh with an ease born of years of experience and went to the other shoulder. This time I remembered to close my eyes before the scalpel went in. When I heard the clang signaling its return to the metal gurney, I knew Gemma was done with the cutting. Even still, I couldn't bring myself to open my eyes. It was much more peaceful to look at the soft peach behind my eyelids. I can't believe we're doing this. Then there was a lot of movement and scuffling along with some more suspicious sucking sounds. A moment of nothing passed, and then another, and another. Finally, Gemma spoke in a loving voice. This is my baby, Striker. Sven flat out giggled. Okay, I had to see. I opened one eye. What I saw made me open both eyes wide. Gemma stood there fully clothed in blue scrubs with a matching blue hospital gown covering her front. To complete the outfit, a plastic visor covered her entire face. The object she was referring to was cradled in her two hands. Silver metal made up the flat, round shaft, and a paddle-shaped saw blade was stuck on a post. It looked like a small-shaped chainsaw. Her eyes twinkled beneath the shiny plastic of the visor. You're sick, you know that, right? I asked just to make sure she understood. Her laughter bounced around the small room. You say that now, but the striker saw is a godsend. If you use a regular saw, your arm gets all tired sawing through. Yeah, you can stop right there, I said, holding up a hand. She just laughed and went back to the body. Since her attention was focused there, mine went there too before my brain could stop me. All I could see was organs like some sick fun house in front of me. Lucky for me, it didn't resemble a human anymore because I think I would have lost my mind. While I had been blissful behind my eyelids, Gemma had been busy. The top of the corpse's skin and muscle tissue were flung over the head, so it was no longer visible. I can only assume a vertical incision from the breastbone to the pubic bone had been made as well, because similar flaps hung open to frame the torso there. Gemma's back came into my view. Hefting the saw in both hands, she brought it down with ease. In that moment, I would have not been surprised if someone told me Gemma was a serial killer. She looked perfectly pleasant going to saw someone to bits. Sure that someone was dead, but she should have been at least a little bothered by it. The high screeching of the saw as it met bones startled me. I could barely breathe. Gemma, on the other hand, started humming the Mr. Rogers theme song. I was seriously starting to doubt whether calling her had been a good idea. After a few minutes of alternating cutting and removing bones, she said idly, So why is a corpse still in the cooler? I mean, the body is usually taken out of the cooler before the autopsy. Chit-chat? Was she for real? Not waiting for a reply, she powered down the saw and set it back in her case before lifting out a pair of scissors that said DuraSharp on the handle. They were a pink-handled version of the ones I had at home. When this was over, I was going home and throwing them away. With careful movements, she reached one hand back in and did some moving around before bringing in the other hand. The snip was audible. She brought the blood-slicked scissors back out and set them back in the case. Then she took out something that looked like tweezers on steroids and went back in. I so did not want to know what she was doing in there. Her brow furrowed and her lips thinned out. Can you get the plastic tarp from the case? What? My voice came out as a squeak. The plastic tarp from the case. Can you get it? She bit off the end of each word like I hadn't understood the first time. What do you need it for? I didn't want to ask, but I couldn't help myself. You know the expression, my heart is in your hands? Let's just say that it's a literal translation in this case. That was it. Can I go? At this point, I knew I was green in the face and sounded like a kindergartner asking for permission, but I didn't care. I just wanted out of there. The folded tarp appeared as Sven handed it to me. Gemma gave me a rueful smile and lifted up one hand. Bloody bits, which I didn't want to begin to try to identify, clung to the latex of her gloves. I wish I could say yes, but at this point, I can't exactly write things down as I go. She nodded to the clipboard I hadn't noticed to her right. Irritated, I snatched the tarp out of Sven's hands. With a few flicks, the square expanded into a neat 5-foot by 8-foot rectangle. I looked back to the body. The size matched to the inch. Okay, I could see what was happening here. Taking a deep breath, I held it as I took a few tentative steps over. With ginger movements, I leaned over and went to lay it over the body. What are you doing? Gemma screeched. I jumped back and sucked in a huge breath in shock. I hadn't jumped back far enough. The smell of lamb, so strong I could almost taste it, enveloped me in an instant. Godsby. I doubled over, coughing and hacking, in a desperate attempt to get the taste out of my mouth. When I came back up, Gemma was still wrist deep in the body. After you're done there, would you mind putting it on the table? At my blank look, she motioned with her head. On the other side of the gurney was a small metal table. Well, excuse me for not noticing a little table when there's a dead body 5 inches from my face, I said. I knew it came across as bitchy as I stalked around the kearney and slapped the tarp on the table, but I didn't care. After feeling like I'd just taken a bite out of death, she could kiss it. She ignored me and lifted out a pulp of flesh with steroid tweezers. It fell into the table with a little squish. That's bizarre. Flipping up the breath-clouded visor, she prodded the heart a couple times. I think I've seen too many scary movies because I expected it to start beating at any moment. She continued to mutter things under her breath until I couldn't take it anymore. What? I said in what came out as a half shout. Yes, it was a crazy outburst, but I couldn't take not knowing what was happening, not on top of everything else. I know this is going to sound insane, but her heart is devoid of blood. She pulled the words out of herself as if she couldn't make sense of them even as she was saying it. It actually looks like the blood has been extracted out of it. Okay, I could have a very logical conversation about this and not freak out. Could she have been sucked dry? Vampires. I wouldn't be surprised if they were behind this. She clicked her tongue. It's possible. Well, let's keep going and see what we find. I had to stop myself from groaning. Of course we had to. After that declaration, it seemed like a parade of flesh and bones filled the space. She stopped when she got to the lower torso, and a puzzled expression came across her freckled face. How long did you say she'd been gone for? I hadn't. A while. That was informative. She rolled her gray eyes. Well, it looks like she was pregnant, so it would be helpful to know the date. Pregnant? Oh, just great. That's one tidbit I would not be relaying to Mr. Carmichael. After all he and the missus had been through, I'm sure they didn't need to know that on top of it. It was longer than 9 months, I conceded as I adjusted my ponytail. She removed a fetus and placed it on the table next to the growing organ cemetery she had going. Her hands trembled ever so slightly as she started to inspect it. After a moment, her mouth opened like she was going to say something. Then she seemed to think better and shut it again. She didn't look horrified. She looked confused. What is it? I asked as I craned my head to get a better look. That stopped me. Was I really trying to get a better view of something that made someone who did this for a living stop in their tracks? Fetuses don't have teeth, she said. Okay, so the baby wasn't human. That piece of information didn't really surprise me. What she said next shouldn't have, but it did. She cleared her throat and said, You see these canines? They're drastically elongated compared to the other teeth. My world slammed to a halt. It was a vampire baby. I knew it. I knew it. I knew it. I knew it. They were at the center of all what was wrong with this world, the root of everything evil. Wait, a vampire baby? How was that possible? Our blood was like a drug to them. They took power from our blood. The feeling it gave to them was a high. The more blood they took, the higher they got. Everyone knew a fairy didn't usually come out of a run-in with a vampire with their lives. That's why our species had moved into the mounds. So why hadn't this fairy been drained to death like all the others? How did her and a vampire have a baby? Gemma twisted her hands, the liquid from her glove making tiny squeaks. I know this is going to sound crazy, but do you think that vampires exist? I mean, if there are winged creatures, which considering what we've seen here is pretty safe to say, it's possible, right? She seemed to be looking for a confirmation that she wasn't crazy. I looked at Sven. His frozen expression said this wasn't easy for him either. With the evidence slapping them in the face, there was no point in keeping this from them. I nodded my agreement. Well, then supposing vampires are real, and this is a vampire fetus, she paused and then rushed on. It would seem the cause of death would be blood loss due to the fetus attaching itself to the umbilical cord. She picked up the umbilical cord to show me what she'd seen. It wasn't until she separated apart a section of it, and 2 identical-sized holes grew large enough that I could see them. I wanted to get mad, but all I could do was be sad. The world was so unjust. Patty had been so loved, such a happy spirit. To know that she'd met such a sad end made me feel immovably tired. It does seem that way, doesn't it? I said. We have to keep this to ourselves, though. Nobody can know about it. I put a hand on her arm, pleading for her to understand. Gemma looked up at me, disbelief in her eyes. You know I'm right, I said, in what hoped I was a convincing tone. If we force vampires out of hiding, they could wipe us out. Look what they did to this poor girl. Do we really want that kind of mass extinction for humanity by forcing their hand? I looked to Sven. He tilted his head to the side, regarding me through hooded eyes, and then gave a reluctant shake of his head. Gemma was slower, but eventually shook her head too. She looked like she wasn't happy about it, though. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. So are we done here? I asked. Gemma half turned to the body. She nodded, but then she said in a rush, But what about the wings? What was she? What if there are more of them out there? Crap. I was really hoping she wouldn't bring that up. I was thinking the same thing. Let me dig into it, and I will let you know. For some strange reason, I missed the spark in her eyes. Yeah, she made a vague motion with her hand. You two can go. I'll leave after I'm done putting everything back together. I nodded, turned, and walked across the cement floor and out of the plastic flaps. Even though he didn't make a sound, I knew Sven was behind me. That fact made me feel a tad better, but neither that nor the warmth of the room we walked into could heat where the cold was the worst. Chapter 14. I didn't want to think about death anymore. I wanted life to be beautiful. I wanted to think about running through rainbows and lying in the grass. But life wasn't pretty, and Sven and I hadn't come from a place of beauty. We'd just come from where Patty had been found. You could almost see the death still there. It hung like a shadow across the earth. Even though we hadn't found anything, it was hard not to let the experience affect me, especially when the recent memory of her corpse was still pressed against my brain. Sven had been very kind about everything since our visit to the saw. It's like he understood how hard this was for me. He hadn't even teased me. He'd just been there for me like a quiet strength. In fact, right now we were on the way to his uncle's house. Turns out he lived in the area. Sven had offered to take a detour there to see if his uncle had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary. Apparently his uncle had some sort of business. Sven didn't have much to say about it, only that he'd recently moved back to town and was out of the loop now. And that was fine with me. I needed a quiet ride like this. It was so peaceful in the forest, the warmth of the sun filtering through the green boughs in a way that made you want to close your eyes and just exist. There was something about spring that made you appreciate being alive. The wind tugged at my hair and snuck out of my helmet. I flipped the visor up to feel the wind on my face. It was cold until I rested my head against Sven's back. Then it was perfect. How are you doing? Sven shouted over his shoulder. Good, I shouted back, and to my surprise, I was starting to feel good. I'm sure it had no little amount to do with the man in my arms either. I gave him a little squeeze and smiled. His hand came down to cup mine for a second. He only gave me a quick pat, but warmth traveled up my hand and brought a smile to my face. If I had to go through this, at least he was here with me. Then he brought his hand back down and slowed. There was a break in the trees ahead. It looked like we were here. Sven turned onto the black paved drive. The motorcycle glided over the smooth pavement. It was more like a dream than reality as the woods opened into a stunning, spotless lawn. The landscape was no small feat, given that it was spring and everything was wet and mushy. We revved up an incline, and the crest of lawn broke, giving way to a full-on mansion. My eyebrows rose as we drove up to it. It got bigger and bigger as we got closer, which was duh, I know. But it was so big, I had a hard time wrapping my mind around what my eyes were seeing. The forest served as a green backdrop to the incredible display. The engine revved again as we sped around the circular drive before coasting to a stop in front of the wide cement steps. Considering the pace we'd taken down the road to get here, the display made me smile at Sven's back. Show off. The steps climbed up to polished oak doors that gleamed in the late evening sun. I set my feet down the same time as Sven. I bit my cheek to keep my smile from turning full of cheese. I could get used to this motorcycle thing. Without the wind, the hot September cooked me inside the leather jacket, so I slipped it off and tossed it over the seat of the bike. I turned my attention back to the house and let out a low whistle. It was even more impressive up close. Sven pulled off his helmet and ran a hand through his already perfect hair before giving me a wink. Not too shabby, huh? I laughed at the understatement. His mouth widened and a laugh of shared amusement burst from his lips. It was a good laugh. It said he was proud of his uncle's obvious accomplishments. I was happy that he was happy. An almost dimple showed itself on his right cheek. A bad boy with a dimple? Shut up. I moved close to him and touched soft fingers to it. His arms wrapped around my waist. They made me feel small and delicate, something I never thought I would feel in my life. Inadequate? Ungraceful? Yeah, but not how he made me feel. He was so perfect for me, sweet, caring, kind, fun, and hotter than Phoenix in the dead of noon. The easy strength of his arm pulled me close. I let my gaze travel from where it was fixed on the delectable dimple of his and sought out his eyes. They shone bright with what in any other time I might have called love, but we'd just met. You didn't love someone you just met, did you? My heart hammered in my chest. What if it was possible? What if they had gotten it right in the storybooks? Then something caught Sven's attention and he looked towards the house. I looked too when I saw what he saw. My world careened out of control and shot into the path of the freight train coming toward us. The train was in the form of a man, tall and glorious. He walked down the stairs towards us with an easy swag that spoke of ownership. You could tell he had been coming down those same steps for decades. It had to be his uncle. It would seem the good looks and chiseled features ran in the family, but that was where the similarities ended. His looks were a direct contrast to Sven's. Long blonde hair fell in a waterfall down his back, and he had a smile that shone brilliant against the darkness of his skin. A black three-piece suit made that caramel skin glow with an otherworldly radiance. He knew how to dress himself. But that wasn't what had me rooted to the ground like I was trying to touch the core of the earth. No, there was an unspeakable truth that hit me. A truth I just knew without ever having to be told. Maybe it was the aura that surrounded his uncle. It radiated darkness and danger in thick waves. And the closer he came, the more it lapped at me. Or maybe it was the way he seemed to float down the steps as if there were none. Whatever it was, I knew. I absolutely knew without a shadow of a doubt. He was a vampire. Chapter 15. If there was ever a time in my life where I was going to faint, this would be it. I waited for my legs to give out, for the ground to open up and welcome me into its embrace. Any moment. It was coming. Nothing happened. Except the vampire. He most certainly was happening, and he was getting closer with every gut-wrenching step. Don't panic, I ordered myself. I couldn't panic. If I let on anything was out of the ordinary, I would be dead in the space of a heartbeat. And then it would only take a drop of my blood for them to know that the biggest con in history had been pulled on them, that fairies did in fact exist, to this day no less, and one was standing right in front of them. I didn't even want to think about what would happen to me then. Then another thought snaked into my head. It froze fear into my veins. No, I fought not to turn to Sven like he'd grown a second head. This couldn't be happening. He couldn't be one of them too. He couldn't be the most foul, vile creature to ever walk the earth. There was no way. But what if he was? The thought ate at me. I had to know. And besides having my throne torn out, there was really only one way to find out. Like the makings of a horror movie, I trailed my hand from where it had caressed his cheek down to his chest. I didn't stop until it was resting where his heart was. I kept my hand steady, desperate for a heartbeat, and waited. Sadness, hopelessness, fear piled on layer after layer. I didn't know how long I left my hand there. Seconds, minutes, hours. I didn't have a clue. All I knew it was long enough to know the one man I wanted above all, the one man who could make everything okay, the one man who I actually could have loved in this horrible world, was the one thing I hated most. A vampire. Chapter 16. This couldn't be happening. How could he be a vampire? How could life be that unfair? I didn't care that his uncle was only about 15 feet away. I needed the answer to be different. I needed him not to be a vampire. Every fiber screamed in my body as I stood on tiptoe and placed my lips to his neck. It was just a light kiss to where any living, breathing person's pulse would throb. I left my lips there while my own heart beat wild in my chest. Nothing. He was a vampire. There was no question. Sadness and anger flared up to war inside me. I wanted to cry. I wanted to fall to the ground and never get up. How could he be such a snake? How could I have been so blind? I berated myself as I pulled away. I wanted to hate him for making me feel like this. His eyes warmed with affection. That was the only thing warm. The hateful thought jolted me. What was wrong with me? Was this really fair? He couldn't help being a vampire any more than I could help being a fairy. I knew my struggle showed on my face, but I couldn't help it. It was too much. Cy? His head turned to the side as if he were trying to see inside my own head. He so didn't want to go there. Hell, I didn't want to go there. I didn't have a choice, though. I mean, I couldn't exactly go on vacation until everything was all better. Better. What did that even mean anymore? His eyes searched mine. The blur of his eyes pierced my heart. This was Sven, the same person who had shared laughs and so much more with, the same person who'd been there for me. How could I just walk away from that? I had to, though. I couldn't be with him and just waltz past the bloodbath of injustice and horror inflicted by his kind. It slammed between us like a wall, cold and impenetrable. Our fates had been decided centuries ago. Well, isn't this a delightful surprise? Interrupted a smooth voice behind me. The sound was deep and welcoming. More lies. I couldn't help the thoughts racing through my mind at this point, even though it was more unfair. I didn't even know this man. Maybe he was nice as apple pie on the 4th of July. But it seemed no matter how hard I tried to tell myself that, I wasn't buying it. Sven turned a reluctant nod to his uncle. I so didn't want to be here and exchange pleasantries, but I couldn't just leave. Left with little choice, I faced him as well. Uncle, so good to see you, Sven said. I could tell he meant it. You as well, nephew of mine. He turned to me with a smile I would have considered pleasing on anyone else. And who is this treasure you have brought with you? There was a split-second hesitation in Sven's body right before he took a hand and wrapped it around my shoulder. This is Cy. Cy, may I present you the incomparable Jarek Coningsby. Jarek reached to take my hand as he stepped forward. I couldn't help but take a mirrored step back. He let out a laugh. It flowed out of him easy, like everything else seemed to be about him. I felt ridiculous to be scared of someone so laid back, but he was a vampire, for the love of gods. How could that even be okay? Forgive me, I am a tad old-fashioned, he said by way of explanation. He didn't make any other motion to come forward. I know because I watched his every move. Your Excellence, said a voice behind me. I whirled around so fast it was a wonder I didn't get whiplash. A portly man stood there with a rake in his hand. No sound had preceded him. Another vampire. I fought down the bubbling panic. They were acting like the world was a normal place. It felt like my sanity was quietly slipping away. What is it, Stanley? Asked Jarek, still not moving. I wondered if this was what the elders meant by vampires having a stillness that surrounded them at all times. It's time, he said, excitement alive in his eyes. Those eyes were the only thing alive about him. I wanted to hit myself, anything to make the thoughts stop. Splendid. Take us to her. Jarek did move this time. I gave him as much berth as possible without drawing too much attention to myself as he glided down the last few steps. Come, Sven. You'll want to see this. Eagerness swept over Sven's features. Is she ready? Asked Sven. She? Ready for what? I don't think I wanted to stick around to find out. Sven took my hand. I let him. Short of jerking it away and causing a scene, there wasn't much I could do. As we walked down the steps, I had to admit myself I needed his touch. It calmed me, which is what I needed when I was so close to freaking out like this. I wondered if he knew I needed his comfort right now. He seemed to be always giving me what I needed. Sadness bled from me as his hand wrapped around mine. It was so unfair. With effort, I pushed the sadness to the side. It huddled in a corner of my heart, far from gone. I needed to focus, though. Now was not the time for self-pity. If I played my cards right, I could crawl in my bed later and take all the time in the world for that. Right now, anything could be going down. I had to be ready. When his uncle made his way around the side of the house, I pulled my hand out of Sven's. I felt the loss of it as soon as our hands parted. I'll just stay here. You guys go, as I said as I put what I told myself was a comforting space between us. Don't be crazy, he said. His voice made it clear we would talk later. I didn't want to acknowledge the feeling that had reared, but I couldn't ignore it. I was petrified there wouldn't be a later for us. I didn't know what I was going to do with that feeling, the feeling that I'd wake up tomorrow knowing I would never see him again. He cradled an arm around me and we rounded the same corner. A long, low building came into view. It was nestled by the forest at the edge of the property. In a space of time that was quicker than I could process, we walked through the wide door into the dirt-packed space. We were in a stable. I saw a group of people crowding by the far stall that led out of an identical door on the other side. Not a group of people, a group of vampires, I corrected myself as we made our way towards them. Give her room, Jarek said from the inside of the stall. The group parted when we walked up, and I braced for the nightmare to come. What I saw shocked me more than anything I could have imagined. A white horse, beautiful and strong, lay on her side. Clean hay was scattered all around her. Little hooves peeked out from behind her tail seconds after we walked up. She was giving birth. I'll be damned, Sven said in a hushed next to me. Pegasus's first foal. Give her room, someone echoed Jarek's command. I backed up. Farther and farther I backed up, my mind furiously trying to process what I saw. What was this? Were these the wicked creatures I'd been told about? Warned about? Could they be such simple people? They were in awe of the beauty of life. Were we really that different? A small mule came from the stall. There were hushed murmurs of approval. The words faded as my feet continued to back of their own accord. A few minutes later, I heard Sven say, Cy? There was confusion in his voice, not unlike the same confusion pinging around in my mind, but we were confused about very different things. I'm sure he wasn't trying to recategorize an entire species in his head. I felt the backs of my feet catch in a solid mass seconds before I fell. I reached my arm out to catch myself. Pain seared through my hand as something pierced my flesh. I retracted my hand, but it was too late. The damage had been done. My teeth rattled as I hit the ground. The pain was blinding. A scream built up in my chest, and I let it out before I could stop myself. Under my leg, I could feel the tines of a rake. I'd reacted in time to prevent any serious damage, but I had pierced my palm. I lifted my hand, and blood trickled in a thin line down my palm and wrapped around my wrist. The air sucked out of the world. Oh, no. No. With the slowness of a horror movie, I raised my eyes to the stable. My worst fears were realized. Everyone was looking at me, and they were only 13 feet away. To make matters worse, in the sea of faces, I didn't see one pair of fangs that weren't out. Even Sven's had come to the party. I wanted to whimper at the sight, but this time I stopped myself. I had to get out of here. My breath froze in my chest as I rose inch by painstaking inch. All eyes were glued on me, on my every move. I could hear Sven breathe from where I was, or maybe it was the sound of my own breath. With the steps of a deer, I went backwards 1 foot at a time. Cy, Sven said. The teeth got in the way of his speech. He said my name darker, wider, like it had been pulled apart. A cry escaped my lips, and I brought my fist to my mouth, too late to stifle the sound. I would not let him see me like this. The fresh wound pressed against my lips, and I could taste the copper of my blood. Too late did I realize that was the wrong thing to do. A hiss came from the front of the pack, and I realized a lithe vampire I hadn't seen inched his way forward. At the sight of the fresh blood, he crouched low, his head turned at an odd angle. His fangs were bared and his eyes wide. The world narrowed to a size of the pin. Before I knew what had been happening, I turned to the woods and could feel my feet pumping beneath me. It occurred to me that I was running just as I broke through the tree line. My lungs burned and my feet screamed, but one thought reigned above all. Run. Chapter 17. Branches clawed at my face as I barreled through the woods. I thrust my hands out to push them away. I didn't know what direction I was heading. East, west. Either way, it didn't matter. I had to get out of here. Twigs snapped beneath me. I couldn't tell how close the vampires were because of the crunch of their feet mixed with the crack of twigs being crushed beneath my own. Another branch smacked my face as I zagged between two trees. Being a bounty hunter had its perks. Like right now, for example, I was used to chases, so I had a couple tricks up my sleeve. I wasn't usually the one being chased, though. I didn't like that, especially considering I was up against vampires. Never mind that little matter of life or death. I prayed the road was in the direction I ran. It was a small chance, but it was all I had. My gut bottomed out as my feet slipped in the mud. That was all it took. I threw my hand out and wobbled, but kept my balance. That was until a body bashed into mine. I screamed and we slammed into the ground. Blood rushed inside me. It drowned out the sound of everything else. Mud and twigs showered onto us as I turned to my attacker's grasp and rained fists and nails down. Jesus, Cy, for the love of God. The world quieted as strong hands grabbed my wrists and pinned them above my head. I didn't know when I closed my eyes, but I opened them at the familiar voice. Sven's unhappy face loomed above mine. Cy, please calm down, please. I wanted to be scared that he was here. With every fiber of my being, I knew I should be, but I couldn't muster it. Instead, my body ached for things I knew I could never have. Calm down? I let out a humorous laugh. How exactly am I supposed to do that? You're a vampire. He dropped his head and shook it, defeat etched into his features. He looked up with a tiredness, and in an instant I knew what he was feeling. I could feel it echoed in my soul. He was sick of hiding what he was. So gut-wrenchingly sick of it. My heart ached for him, for me, for us. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't be with him. I couldn't be with a vampire. Just when were you planning on bringing that little tidbit up anyway? I didn't bother to hide the bitterness that ate at me after they had tore me apart in that barn. I didn't know, okay? He paused and looked into my eyes, looking for something that wasn't there. Acceptance. It isn't something I just tell everyone. How do you think I've stayed alive for so many centuries? So, never? I asked, fury bubbling in my gut. I gritted my teeth to stop myself from sifting. I didn't even want to imagine what being Fae would do to this already tenuous situation. No, not never. I would have eventually. I know I would have. What we have is too special. You're too special. I pushed the lump down that had formed in my throat at his quiet declaration. It didn't matter. It couldn't. He was a monster who, given the chance, would devour my entire race without a second thought. How was I supposed to be okay with that? How could a hamburger love the person eating it? The answer was easy. It wouldn't. The cold analysis wasn't the hard part. The strings tugging at my heart like fishhooks was. I opened my mouth to speak, but let it fall closed again. Nothing I could say was going to make any of this okay. Wisps of grass caressed my cheek as I turned away. I ignored the hot tears that began to blur my vision. A tickle started on my skin. I was about to sift. Biting the inside of my cheek, I wished for the feeling to go away, to leave me with the emptiness of nothing else. Cy, don't. Don't kill us before we've had a chance. The sky above us darkened, almost to black. Thunder cracked above. His hushed voice blended into the sound. It pulled my heart into strings and knotted them up. I wished how his words made me feel would disappear as quick. I wanted to feel normal again. Well, as normal as I got anyway. The numbness inside of me screamed that I would never be the same. It took another crack of lightning to realize the display above was coming from me. I needed to get control of it before Sven realized what was going on. With a Herculean effort, I worked to release the trickle of Kundalini energy that I had pulled. The clouds scattered. Thank the gods, this was at least one question I wasn't going to have to answer. One panic-worthy thing at a time, please. The tempering of my emotions brought my attention back to the presence of the man on top of me. Despite his beautiful lies, we couldn't be together. This was going to be the last time I saw him, and it hit me like a freight train. I needed to imprint his face into my memory. The need to imprint his face into my memory pulled at me with a hurricane's force. I turned back to look at him. It was a mistake. A lock of rich brown hair had fallen into his eyes that screamed a silent plea to mine. At my unwavering stare, his look changed. Determination lit up his face. Something in me twisted at the possessiveness there, and I fell, lost to all logic. Hyper-awareness shot through me. The pressure of his fingers on my wrist, the press of his body against mine, enveloped me like magic. It was magic more powerful than anything coming through the ley lines. His face lowered to mine. I couldn't turn away. Then he stopped, his lips painful inches from mine. Need crawled inside me, ripping holes into my resolve. A small whimper escaped me. Then his silk lips met mine with the barest of touches. Need coursed through me. The heady taste of him drove lust and regret through me. His hands unlatched my wrists. He wound his arms around me and pulled me close. I gasped into his mouth as all of his hard planes kissed my soft curves. He took the opportunity to his sweet assault past my lips. His tongue darted into the warm recesses and met my tongue, rigid with need. I tried not to kiss him. I did, but how could I say no? I broke down, weaving my tongue in and around his, carried away by the storm raging inside. I didn't know how long we were locked like that, our lips and mouths plundering, ravaging, before he broke the kiss. A sound tore from me as our lips parted. Our eyes collided, his imploring, mine wild with uncertainty. His eyes pierced me. Stay with me. Every fiber of my being screamed to be with him. I wanted it more badly than I'd wanted anything and longer than I could remember. But how could I? He was a vampire. If he had known what I was, we wouldn't even be here right now. I'd be lying dead in an alley if he had his way. Wouldn't I? That's what I'd always been taught. I didn't know why now my silly head told a different tale. A voice cleared at our feet before I let out a little light chuckle. I moved my head to the side so I could see around Sven's body that was still molded to mine. Jarek stood there, his black visage stark against the emerald backdrop of the forest. It would appear everything has been sorted out adequately, he asked, in what for all intents and purposes was a pleasant voice. I couldn't help the blush that I knew snaked up my neck. That he saw me making out with Sven like we were teenagers was more than a little embarrassing. I don't know if the embarrassment or the rock forming in my gut was stronger. How was I supposed to talk to him like everything was fine? A vampire. I know I had just been talking to Sven, but he felt so different. Luckily for me, Sven saved me from having to answer by standing up. Yes, Uncle. He reached a hand down to me. After the slightest of pauses, I took it. Got about 8 minutes left in this chapter. We might make it through, so let's give it a shot. A merry jingle. Chapter 18. A merry jingle danced above my head as I pushed the glass door open. I wanted to rip the happy bell off the door arm and throw it. I was in no mood for cheer. I'd just spent the last 3 days in my house moping. After the emotionally exhausting flee from Jarek's house, Sven had brought me home. Too many emotions and unspoken words had swirled between us before he left, and just like I'd thought, that was the last time I saw him. Don't get me wrong, he'd tried to contact me. I'd ignored plenty of phone calls and door knocks, not enough of him to where he fell into stalker status, mind you, just enough to know he wanted me and wasn't going to let me go without a fight. That hadn't helped my emotional state either. I went between fear, love, loneliness, and lust in a carousel of misery. All I wanted was to get off it. All I'd succeeded in doing was becoming a wreck. It wasn't a feeling I was used to, and I hated it. I couldn't stay at my apartment forever, though, so I'd put a cork in the bottle of my emotions and came out. I had this case to solve anyway. Feelings be damned. Besides, I always felt better when I was doing something. I'd been to the office to go over the file again. I went over the notes from the autopsy while I was there. Then I'd gathered the picture of the wounds on the body so we couldn't identify and had come here to the most reputable medical store in town. I looked around. A hodgepodge of books, stacked old medical tools, and other scary pieces were stacked on top of each other and wedged into every corner. If there was an order to the disaster, it eluded me. It looked like it was more in line of antiques than medical equipment. Thanks for the research, though, Sandy. She helped me on cases as I needed it, or not helped, as was the case here. An old man was hunched over a counter in the back of the store. He turned a thin instrument over in his hand, bringing it close to his face to inspect it. It didn't look like he was sitting on a stool, more like his back was bowed from standing in that same position for years and years. He lifted his head. Glasses that had a bronze spyglass welded to them teetered on his nose. The spyglass was pulled out like a telescope and caused the glasses to sway when he moved. He smiled a toothy smile in greeting. I lifted the corners of my mouth in response before I ducked into the nearest aisle. It wasn't technically a smile, but I didn't know him well enough to care. It took me longer than I would have thought to wander through the maze of aisles. It wasn't a huge store, but more aisles than not dead-ended into nowhere. I had turned around and retraced my steps a half a dozen times. There were so many instruments to look at, could have told me I was going down different aisles, and I would have believed you. Some instruments were easy to identify, like forceps. Most of them, however, were odd-looking and more than a little creepy. I made the mistake of picking one of them up. It was a metal circle with 2 half rings inside. They were joined together by a hinge to form a loose Y. The row of spikes between made me wonder, so I turned the dangling tag over. I almost dropped it when I saw the words spermatoria ring and scrawled there. Part of me wished it wasn't so good at identifying root words. Sperm. I prayed it hadn't been used as I dropped it back on the cracked wooden display shelf. After that, I gave up my search and went to the counter. The man hadn't moved from his spot, but he did have a different instrument in his hands. This one was sharp. I'd be sure not to piss him off. I finished the photo from my wallet as I stepped up to the counter. "Excuse me?" I said. He lifted his head. He lifted his head again. A huge eye loomed at me through his glasses. As it turned out, the spyglass continually bobbed from the other end of the eyeglasses made him a little hard to talk to. I handed him the picture anyway. "I was wondering if you could tell me what made those marks?" He looked at the picture for a minute. Then with slow movements, he peeled off his glasses. I tried not to look shocked that his eyes seemed just as big without the glasses. Never taking his eyes from the picture, he opened his mouth to speak, then stopped and licked his lips with slow movements before trying again. "I'm sorry, dear. I couldn't tell you what made them." "Well, crap." "Okay, thanks." I had to snap my mouth shut when he kept going. "But from the position here and the mark in the middle," he brought a crooked finger up and to brush at the wrist in the picture. "It looks like it was some kind of device to either intravenously feed the patient, extract blood, get platelets, or inject medication. It looks rather antiquated, but the diamond pattern may have been to hold the device in place. Since a vampire already had draining equipment built in, so to speak, they must have been injecting her with something. Whether it be drugs or food was anyone's guess. While I turned this new information over in my head, I saw the last thing I would have expected. Sven walking across the street, and he didn't look too happy. There was no mistaking if he was a vampire today. A feral look was at home on his face as he stalked across the street. A black trench coat billowed out behind him. It framed a tight black shirt and those low-slung jeans I'd lusted after. Anticipation skittered up my spine. It took a split second to admire him before logic chimed in. A vampire was coming in here, and he was pissed. At me. I sucked in a few choice cuss words. I threw a thank you to the old man as I snatched up the picture. My feet had just disappeared into the nearest aisle when Sven burst into the store. The door smacked against the wall with a deep reverberating whong. The bell chime sounded strangled as it wedged between the arm and the wall. I didn't have time to take gratification in silencing, though, as I crept through the tiny aisles on tiptoes. Thanks to my aimless wandering earlier, I found my way this time. When I reached the front of the store, I shoved the picture in my purse, at a loss for what to do. Then I spied a yellow skeleton wedged between 2 stacks of books. Bingo. Crouching forward, I peeked through it to see if I could make a run for it. To my relief, at least that's what I told myself, Sven was nowhere to be seen. With any luck, he'd gone back to where I was. That would give me enough time to slip out. He'd be none the wiser. It was for the best, I reminded myself in my stomach as I crept backwards. The leather of my jacket settled against a solid mass. Shit. I know why you're avoiding me. Sven's voice razored in my ear. He thought he knew. My body was a coil that twisted tighter and tighter. It was a miracle I hadn't snapped already. I wanted to yell that he had no clue. Wasn't it just like a man to think he knew everything? I couldn't be mad at him, though. under the anger, I could feel his need like a physical thing. The real problem was the same need echoed inside me. It was so unfair. I couldn't turn around. I couldn't say anything. So I just stood there, watching the traffic pass out the window in front between the ribcage of the skeleton. Sven ran his hand down the length of my hair. The strands moved against my neck, caressing. I fought the urge to sink into the sensation. Cy, this is ridiculous. God's how I wished it were. Look at me, he said. I closed my eyes. I couldn't. My eyes burned behind my eyelids. Strong hands gripped my biceps, and he turned me around before I could react. I wasn't used to being around someone who was so fast. My eyes flew open, and I was staring into the blue fire of his. I said, look at me. I didn't want to, but I couldn't help it. So I settled on glaring. If I couldn't make my body behave, at least I could hate him for it. At least I wanted to hate him. I couldn't actually feel anything more than a wild beating of anticipation at his nearness, though. But he didn't need to know that. So I'm a vampire. So what? It isn't the end of the world, he said. It could very well be, I shot back. Oh, for the love of... The tendons popped out in his neck. What is it going to take? Do you want me to promise not to kill you? Not to turn you? Done and done. It's not that simple, I told the cluttered wall behind him. I couldn't look at the earnestness in his eyes anymore. If I saw it again, I might do something stupid like kiss him to make everything okay. Okay for him, that is. Too bad the only solace I could offer was the very temporary variety. Bullshit, was all I spat out. Just give us a chance. We could be so good together. You know that. You felt it too. I know you did. What's bullshit is that you followed me here, I countered, trying to regain my anger. I didn't follow you. His voice rose like the very idea offended him. Then how'd you know where I was? Sandy told me. He had the decency to look embarrassed before he pulled himself together again. Just what was I supposed to do when you wouldn't answer the door or return my calls? Nothing. You do nothing. I looked at him as I said it to make sure he understood. He had to go away. I had so badly wanted him to do nothing, to just leave. At least that's what I told myself. I wanted to be able to walk away and never look back, to be able to live my life just as I always had, to act as if it hadn't been forever changed in the blink of an eye. You can't give us up on us that easily, he said. His voice pulled at me. I wanted to give him something, anything, but I couldn't. I couldn't pretend things were like they'd been, just like I wouldn't sit here and pretend this wasn't tearing me apart. I bit back a bitter laugh. You think this is easy? He ignored my statement and came closer. I told myself to move back, but my stubborn feet didn't budge. You want me, he said with a confidence I couldn't deny. Any red-blooded girl would, I countered in a voice weakened by his nearness. His eyes moved to my neck, and I could almost feel the blood pulse in the vein at my eyes. Don't say blood, he said, his voice matching mine. I couldn't help the laugh that bubbled. I didn't know if it was hysteria. There wasn't much time to contemplate it because he picked up my hand and lifted it to where it was level with my collarbone. He brought his other hand up to meet it. In it, he held a wheel. It had dull spikes decorating it. With deliberate movement, he turned my hand over. Do you know what this is? He asked as he nudged up the sleeve of my jacket. I didn't. It looked a little scary, but brain be damned, I still trusted him. He continued on like I'd answered him. It's a Wartenberg wheel. It's a nerve stimulator. I was in the middle of asking why would they want to stimulate nerves as he rolled it across the sensitive wrist of my flesh. The words died on my lips as a delicious tingle followed the wheel's wake. I closed my eyes, savoring the sensation. God's alive, I so liked him. A small chink of metal against glass was all I heard before I felt his free hands sink into my hair. He cupped me tenderly as his lips came against mine. They felt like a ray of sunshine, worn and wonderful, and moved over mine, slow and seeking. It was a sweet torture. Poison, and the only food I could eat. My heart broke out in a sweat as I fought with myself. I was too afraid to move. If I did, I would lose myself, and this wasn't a battle I could lose. I couldn't have him, no matter how much I wanted him, no matter how every atom in my body screamed for him. I couldn't. Finally, he let go of me, breaking the kiss. A hot tear escaped from the corner of my eye. When you want to be happy, come find me. His voice sounded stronger than it had when he found me. Too bad I couldn't say the same for myself. And we're going to stop there. We are a little over an hour, but I had to finish that chapter. I didn't want to leave you on a bad note with them. I wanted to give you a little bit of anticipation. So that's that part. We will start back next time on chapter 19. Next week, we will have a Monday, Wednesday, Thursday schedule because of the holidays. I have a engagement on Friday. So it's going to get a little bit boop, 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 boop. But I know a lot of you are watching it as a replay anyway. So fingers crossed that that will be okay for you. So thank you again for coming and watching. And you guys have a great day. Bye.